Okay, in this video, we are going to be talking about biodiversity and ecological succession. So how do we measure the different species in an environment, and how does that change, and how can we measure the health because of that biodiversity? So first up, take a moment. What do you think happened to this area before it was turned into a forest? Okay, so I got a lot of answers, a lot of various answers. Some people thought that this was the effect of glaciers or maybe forest fire or something like that, or it was just a barren mountainside at one point. This was actually a mine at one point. So quarry of some sort. We have these tiered layers where the mine went down into the ground. You can see that this is probably where about they stopped. But you can see that nature has kind of taken over this area. You can see a lot of trees and shrubs starting to form. So that's what we're going to be looking at. How do these species change the environment around them, and how do we measure this change? So the first thing to talk about is biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variety of life in an ecosystem. So all of the plants, all of the animals, all of the bacteria, all of the single-celled organisms, all of those are going to tie into the biodiversity. What different species do we have in this ecosystem? We can measure this in a couple ways. Species richness, which is the number of species in a specified area, and species evenness, which is the abundance of those species. So if we look at two different communities, both of these have the same species richness. They both have the same number of species. We have large trees, we have these pine trees, we have these smaller, maybe birch trees, and we have these tiered trees here. And the same thing can be said for community 2. But you notice in community 1, we have an even split. There are 4 of each of these trees, so we have a different evenness than we do over here. You can see in this ecosystem, something could be causing the yellow trees, these potentially birch trees, to be much more prevalent than their neighbors. So you see we only have 1 of these big trees, we only have 2 pine trees, we only have 2 of these tiered trees. The rest of them are this kind of yellowy birch tree. So you can see even though they have the same richness, they have different diversity. So take a moment, how does ecosystem on the left compare to the ecosystem on the right? The ecosystem on the left, you can see that both of these have the same species. We have this fiery searcher, which is a type of caterpillar-eating beetle. We have darkling beetles, and we have Hercules beetles in both environments. So the richness is about the same. The evenness, on the other hand, is very different. Over here, we have a lot more of these fiery searchers. On this side, we have a lot more of the darkling beetles. So you can see that there may be some environmental factor that we're not looking at that may tie into which species becomes more prevalent in certain areas. Maybe there's more caterpillars over here for the fiery searchers to eat, maybe more decaying wood and things for these darkling beetles to eat over here. So how can biodiversity be impacted by introduced species? So introduced species or invasive species are organisms that come into an environment that don't have any natural predators. They are not naturally found there, so they have no predators or ways to control them. What happens is we get losses in biodiversity. So for example, this is the emerald ash borer. It's a species of beetle found in Asia. It was brought over accidentally through lumber shipments. And what it does is it bores holes into ash trees, creating this kind of web, this kind of lined kind of markings in the trees. And what this does is it kills the trees. So all of the organisms that were dependent upon this species of tree are out of habitat now. They don't have a tree to nest in or a tree to feed on. So all of the other species are just impacted by this singular beetle. Not only that, but as humans, our ecosystem is also impacted by, or our economy is also impacted by this. These trees are hardwood. They're often used for different pieces of furniture or fuel or different things like that. So as these hardwood trees die, so does the economy to some extent. There is a lot of downsides to this loss of natural resources. So you've probably seen other examples of invasive species. For example, the lionfish on the other side, or on this slide here, brown marmorated stink bug. Both of those are non-native in their areas. Lionfish is very predatory, so it eats a lot of other fish. Brown marmorated stink bugs are actually a pest on fruit trees. So you'll get these fruits that have these little blemishes, these little marks, because the stink bug sucked the juice out of it. So these can have a very damaging impact on the ecosystem as well as us. So a lot of our materials are reliant on biodiversity. Climate is very important with biodiversity. As we start to destroy more trees and more trees start to die, our climate's going to be negatively impacted. Different resources and nutrients have to be cycled through this biodiversity, so that's going to be impacted. And of course, just enjoyment of the outdoors as a whole is impacted by loss of biodiversity. So the next thing we're going to talk about is succession. So succession is the process of moving to new species. So we are developing as an ecosystem. We have primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession happens when we start with an environment that is a clean slate. There's nothing on it. It's typically found to be bare rock. So you can imagine this to be like the beginning of the Earth, or new islands that are formed by volcanoes. And what's going to happen are these pioneer species, typically in the form of moss and lichen. These species grow where there is nothing else, and they grow very rapidly. So we can think of this as the pioneers who went out west to colonize California and Oregon and those areas. So these moss and lichens are going to be the first ones on the scene. They are going to grow and die, and as they grow and die, they start to produce the soil needed for weeds to start growing. Things like dandelions, chicory, grasses, things like that. And as these weeds grow, they are again going to pave the way for larger species to appear, these slower growing species like shrubs and trees. And eventually, depending on what type of biome this is, it could develop into something as extensive as a forest. Secondary succession, on the other hand, we already start out with some sort of environment, and we do something to damage it. For example, wildfire is a very common example of secondary succession. What happens is these species that were normally in the area, they get killed by the wildfire or the flooding. And again, just like in primary succession, over time, the species are going to grow back. So weeds and wildflowers are going to grow first. Shrubs and small seedlings are going to grow second. And then over time, this forest is going to develop. So primary succession, we are going to start with nothing. We are going to start from some sort of maybe a volcanic reaction or volcanic eruption or receding glacier or something. We're going to start with nothing. It's going to start on bare rock. These pioneer species are going to develop and help to break down the rock and produce more soil and produce more plants and animals that have adapted to those conditions. And this is going to happen really slowly. This takes many, many, many years. Secondary succession, on the other hand, is going to be the result of some sort of natural occurrence, so forest fire, flood. There is going to be previously existing life that helps to bring it back. So there are a lot of trees and things that are adapted to fire. Especially out in California, you'll find a lot of trees that when they produce seeds, the seeds don't open up until forest fire has come through. So a lot of these will start to grow as a result of this secondary succession. We're going to start with previously existing soil, and this is going to regrow pretty fast. They're both going to be gradual, but this one is going to happen a lot faster than primary succession. And in this, we can usually measure whether a species is going to grow fast or if it's going to grow slow. And we call these R and K selected species. So R selected species are your pioneer species, the ones that grow really fast, have a very short lifespan. They're going to grow up, they're going to reproduce, and they're going to die. So you can see this boom and bust situation that usually happens with them. You get a very quick spike of population growth. These populations are going to produce a lot of seeds, a lot of offspring, and then they're going to die off. On the other hand, you have these K-selected species, and they take a long time to grow. These are typically your slow growers, your shrubs, your trees. We as humans will be K-selected to some extent. So these ones are going to take a while, and they're going to go up to carrying capacity. We're going to reach a point where we can't have any more, and they're just going to plateau out. You can see that's not the case with our selected species. They go and pass the carrying capacity, and that's when we get that bust situation, when the nutrients are too low for this, and it's going to cause them to collapse, the population to collapse. So K-selected species, they may produce less offspring. That's also due to them being so slow to grow, but they are going to kind of grow up and remain constant so long as nothing happens to them. So take a moment. I have 5 different pictures here. If we were to measure this in terms of primary succession, what would the order of these images be? Okay, so primary succession, we start out with nothing. So we start out with rocks. These rocks are going to give way to mosses. The mosses will give way to different R-selected species, like dandelions. Those dandelions will allow shrubs to grow, and finally, assuming we are in some sort of forest biome, trees will end up taking over these K-selected species so that we develop a forest. So the last thing we're going to talk about, so we measured what biodiversity is, how does an ecosystem recover from some sort of event. Now, what could those events be? Well, one of the biggest ones that are going to impact ecosystems are humans, us. And ecosystems are going to be disturbed many ways from human interaction. For example, land use, using land to develop farms, to develop malls, to develop cities, as well as used for mining and resource gathering, is going to negatively impact all of the species that live there. It's going to displace a lot of species, and those that can't get displaced, can't move to another area to survive, are going to end up dying as a result. We can also have impacts on pollution, so the runoff of chemical substances. These usually result in a lot of negative effects for things like trees, things like animals. If it gets into the water source, it can negatively affect fish or the animals that drink the water. So pollution from chemicals is going to be really important, but also light pollution and noise pollution. So typically we only think of the chemicals and the plastics and that kind of thing, but noise and light pollution are just as bad. In fact, noise or light pollution really affects not only night-dwelling species like bats and moths that rely on the darkness and have adaptations to deal with that, but things like sea turtles. Sea turtles rely on the moon at night to find their way to the ocean after they hatch from their egg. If we have a lot of light pollution, the turtles are going to get confused and they're not going to be able to find their way to the ocean like they would normally be able to do. And that would lead to a lot of population decrease for these sea turtles. Introduced species, like we had said previously, are going to reduce the amount of biodiversity by killing off things that can't compete with it, leading to drops in biodiversity. Resource exploitation, similar to the land use, we have a lot of things that we need to do or make, so as we constantly consume all of these resources, it's going to take away from the rest of the environment. So mining coal, hunting fish, or hunting and fishing, cleaning forests of their trees and of the resources, all of which are going to be negative for the environment. And the last one, and the one that has seen a lot of controversy over the late years, is climate change. So as we dig up all those resources and we use them for ourselves, we have been negatively impacting the atmosphere with the production of carbon dioxide. What this does is it causes the temperature of the Earth to rise. So as more carbon dioxide builds up, it's going to make a thicker atmosphere, which is going to hold in more heat and raise the temperature of the Earth. What this does is not only can it kill the species that are adapted to cold weather. For example, the polar and Antarctic species that have adapted to cold temperatures are being negatively affected because the temperature is rising. They're not used to it, and it's rising at a rate fast enough that they cannot keep up. They cannot adapt to it, so they end up going extinct as a result. It can also affect species that live at the equator. Those that can't live end up drying out. There's a lot of heat there, so too much heat and not enough rain will cause droughts and things like that to happen. But the species that can move will start moving north and south to better temperatures, ones that they can manage a little better. And not only does this affect what species end up surviving that migration, but can cause new instances of invasive species, of introduced species. So even though they are native to maybe the continent, they are not native to that area and are going to negatively impact the rest of the biodiversity. So you can see from these human interactions, we have a lot that can cause damage to the environment. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all doom and gloom. There are ways that we can improve. For example, reducing carbon footprint, growing trees, trying to cut down on things like light pollution or noise pollution or pollution in general. All of those can help to slow our effects on the environment. So that is where I'm going to end this video. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.